languages, you're trilingual. If you speak 2 languages, you're bilingual. If you speak only 1 language, then you're an American. While this saying is certainly a humorous generalization, we must admit that it contains a lot of truth. Most, if not all of you, were required to study 2 or 3 years of a foreign language while you were in high school. But if you don't practice or learn this language beyond that mere 2 or 3 years, your ability to communicate in your second language will decrease and decrease as time goes on. You may think, do I really need a second language? I mean, English is the global language of the world, after all. Well, as John Butcher of the Beijing Review notes in his article, A Word to the World, Latin was once distinguished in a similar way, although certainly on a lesser scale. While it is unlikely that English will die out anytime soon, the increasing numbers of speakers of other languages, such as Chinese, may threaten its dominance. Our identity as a nation of monolinguals presents a problem. The solution lies in greater fluency in a relevant second language from an earlier age. Today I want to take a look at the problems associated with America being a monolingual nation, and I want to take a look at a 2-part solution. The first part, greater fluency in a relevant second language, and the second part, greater fluency from an earlier age. Let's begin by taking a look at the problem, our identity as a nation of monolinguals. Our nation is known as the Great Melting Pot. Past and present Americans come from all countries, cultures, and backgrounds. Naturally, if millions of people of diverse nationalities are to communicate with one another and cooperate together, a common language must be adopted. In our case, this common language, and eventually for most of us, our first language, has been English. Alexander Lyon McPhee, writing for academic journal Rethinking History, notes that different languages lead to the creation of different interpretations of the same world. Of course, languages were made by fallible human beings, so no one language's interpretation of the world is going to be the perfect and complete one. Naturally, your first language is going to have the greatest influence on how you think and on how you view the world around you. But the problem with speaking only one language is that you're only familiar with one interpretation of the world. Understanding someone else who comes from a different background, speaks a different language, interprets the world differently, is going to be very difficult. Not only will you be unable to communicate on a very basic level with that person, but you will be unable to come even close to truly understanding that person. Right now, English is the international common language of the globalized world. But as the current Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, points out, quote, "For too long, Americans have relied on other countries to speak our language, but we won't be able to do that in the increasingly complex and globalized world." End quote. A solution to this problem must be intentional if it is to be effective. First, we need to prioritize fluency in a relevant second language. Many high school students choose to study Spanish, French, or even Latin as their required high school language. These languages are important, of course, but according to Science Magazine Discover's 2010 article, 20 Things You Didn't Know About Language, actually Mandarin Chinese has the most native speakers, around 845 million. The article goes on to note that in the United States, only 3% of elementary schools and 4% of secondary schools are even offering Chinese. I spent my high school years growing up in China, and interestingly enough, I saw almost the opposite thing taking place there. Nearly every person my age that I met had studied English from kindergarten on. A certain English proficiency is even a requirement for most universities. A couple years ago, I worked as an English teacher at several 2-week, 24-hour English camps put on by a Chinese school. The children who went to these camps were ages 6 to 16 and had been sent to these camps by their parents in hopes of improving their English. Though there was some Chinese translation, it was expected that all the classes, activities, games, etc. would take place completely in English. So, obviously the Chinese are pretty serious about learning their second language. They see English as the global language of the future and know that if China is to influence the world, then her people must speak a language other than her first language. China's foreign language policies, if rather limited, are very relevant. This doesn't mean that we in America need to ditch Spanish and Latin and force every school-aged child to study Chinese. But it does mean we need to make sure that we are prioritizing other relevant, widely spoken languages, such as Chinese, Arabic, Russian, and encourage greater study of these languages. Relevant language study won't help much without the second part of the solution, greater fluency from an early age. Back to my previous example about China's foreign language policies. I think there are two things that make their second language learning very effective. First, students are required to study a relevant second language, and two, they are required to do so from an early age. The early years are undeniably the best for learning your second language. J. Madeline Nash of Time magazine explores the complexities of the young brain in her article entitled Fertile Minds. From birth to age 6, the brain is forming thousands upon thousands of neuron connections known as synapses. It forms far more than the brain can possibly use. And it's formed through repeated experiences, such as specific sights or sounds. This time is going to be your best time for learning language. The brain forms a peak density of synapses around age 2, and this density remains until age 10 or 11. But about age 10, the brain starts destroying the weakest synapses, the ones it doesn't really need, preserving only those that have been magically transformed by experience, end quote. Citing research by pediatric neurologist Dr. Peter Huttenlocher, Nash concludes that children should be taught the second language beginning in elementary school, if not earlier. Requiring our students to begin studying their second language in elementary school would enable them to make the most of their prime language learning years, and would thus promote greater second language fluency. At present, America's reputation as a monolingual nation, poses a problem. Requiring greater fluency in a relevant second language from an early age would help remedy this solution. Probably for many of you, your prime language learning years are behind you. But all of you are the current and future influencers of our nation and the world. And you will influence the next generation through education and everything else, whether you approach this actively or passively. It is important that the next generation be able to communicate with people of other cultures, both on a basic level in the areas of business, education, etc., but also to be able to understand and communicate on a deeper level with other people. For how else will we truly, as globalized citizens, be able to truly cooperate together and learn from each other? Nelson Mandela, as quoted by the New York Times, once said, quote, "If you talk to a man in language he understands, that goes to his head. But if you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart." End quote.